Glad to see so many of you here after hibernating for a couple of weeks. It's really, at any rate, we do have some new people here, so I do need to tell you a few pieces of important information. Number one, about the exits here. We do have two. One is to the rear of the chapel, where most of you came in, and the other one is through the reading room here. So in case of an emergency and we would have to evacuate, you could choose either one. The other thing is that also through the reading room and an immediate right is going to be the restroom. So you can find that. It is dark right now, but I think you shouldn't have any problems. The last thing, please make sure that your cell phones are silent before we go ahead. That said, once again, let me welcome you to St. James Chapel for the first of the 2018 Fireside Chats. My name is Sue DiLorenzo, and I'm the volunteer coordinator for the chats along with John and Gloria Golden. The chats started about 8 years ago for the St. James Bicentennial celebration, and they've been continuing ever since, providing interesting topics of local interest, actually. Tonight we begin the series with a discussion of Olin Dows, a local Hudson Valley artist and a family friend of St. James parishioner Franklin Roosevelt. How many times have we gone into the Hyde Park post office and admired the colorful murals that are on the walls? I know I have, and I really didn't know anything about them. I didn't know the artist, nor did he have any other works. So tonight we're going to learn a little bit more about the artist from tonight's speaker, William Chip Holman, who is the godson of Olin Dows. Chip is a local resident and partner in the William Holman Gallery in New York City. The gallery was founded in 2012. And it exhibits an international group of contemporary artists working in painting, drawing, sculpture, new media, and installation. The gallery represents the estate of Olin Dows. So please welcome Chip Holman.
Is that the clicker? All right. Good evening. Thank you all for coming out. I just have to get a few electronics here. So I can see what you're seeing. The clicker goes that way. Okay, there we are. Trying to get. Okay, yeah, it's just a little close. Okay. Can you all hear me? Yes. All right, well, good evening. I'm here to talk about Olin Dows, who I knew from a small child, and his wife Carmen, and they lived north of here about 10 miles on the river at a house called Glenburn. And what you see now from Route 9 is Southlands, which is the horse farm, which belonged to his sister, Deb Dows, who succeeded him. He died in 81, she died in about 1992 or 3. And she was sort of a famous horse trainer and character in these parts. Olin was a quiet man. He never really spent a lot of time promoting himself or even talking about the things that he was doing. I'm sorry, this is just too close. But he was born in Irvington in 1904. He moved about 1906 or 7 here around Rhinebeck and Statsburg. He lived in a house before Glenburn, just south of there, which eventually became part of the Anderson School. He was educated here. He then went to St. Mark's School in Massachusetts, and from there decided to study art. He went to Harvard University for a year and a half and left. He went to Yale University for a half a year and left. He then went to the Art Students League for about 9 months, studied with, among others, Thomas Hart Benton, and also left. So he never quite finished any of that. He'd begun his art lessons here at Vassar College with a man who is very unknown, named Clarence C.K. Chatty Chatterton, which is a wonderful Hudson Valley name, who was a professor of drawing at Vassar, and he studied with him from the age of 15 or 16. It was quite clear what he wanted to do, and he never really varied, never really wavered from that intent. He obviously came from a family that could afford to indulge it, so he did his art, and probably his other great achievement beyond his artwork was his war service, which I will not talk about tonight, but he was a highly decorated soldier, spoke German, captured Germans, walked across Europe to Germany through D-Day and some pretty horrific battles to get through the war, and he documented it. There are about 300 watercolors of his war work and thousands of small pencil drawings and some quite wonderful journals. Sorry, I have to see if I can figure it out. Sorry, I'm just trying to do this twice. This portrait of him was taken, I'm not sure who the photographer was. He was in Mexico on a trip in 1929 and spent a lot of time with the Mexican muralists. And as you'll see in a few minutes, he had a lot of influence on the mural projects of the Treasury Department throughout the United States in the 1930s. A lot of what he learned about murals, he learned on this trip, and he became very interested in the art form as a means of being able to present work, to put it in public buildings, to put it in very large scales. He knew Siqueiros, he knew Rivera, Frida Kahlo. All of his characters were there. He went for a summer. It's unclear whether he went back, but he did quite a lot of work while he was there. Among them, this series of woodcuts. These are woodcuts on boxwood. They're about 10 by 12 inches each. There are about 15 of them in a series, and they were printed both in Mexico and here back in the United States. And another one of these, Market Day in Oaxaca in Mexico. They're very stylized. They're wonderfully, as close to abstraction as probably he ever got. He was a life drawing person. He drew from the figure. He did slightly stylized and uncharacteristic works in the 30s, which you'll see in a minute. But this is probably as close to this style of the 1920s, late 20s, early 30s, black and white, very severe lines, all done in these little boxwood wood blocks that we actually still have. This is a lithograph, one of very few that he did. He did a book called Franklin Roosevelt at Hyde Park after the war, which has a number of lithographs of places that Roosevelt went, and they really look very much in some ways like the murals that you'll see, the ones in the post office, and other realistic, more illustrative work that he did. This is a very whimsical scene of these zebras jumping around at Southlands, which is the house where he grew up. There's a stream that goes through it, and there are 4 seasons. These were done around 1930, and were one of the very few lithographs that we have any record of him ever completing. But you can begin to see that the scale and the kind of way that these images are put on paper and then lithographed, they do speak to a mural sensibility. He liked to do things in large scale, and he would supervise thousands of those sorts of works. Although his works here in this post office are relatively modest in scale, some of the ones that he knew about and was involved with were very, very large. He lived here. This is on 9G, just outside of Rhinebeck. The barns are still there. It's changed a little bit. You'll notice they're very feathered, stylized sense of the trees, which is very much like the American Regionalist School of which he was a part. He studied with Benton. He knew about Curry. He knew about the regionalists in the Midwest and what they worked on, how they worked. Many of them worked in watercolor. Charles Birchfield rarely painted. Olin Dows rarely painted. He found a mastery of watercolor on paper, and with the exception of some screens that he did that are big sort of enameled works, folding screens, the watercolors are probably his greatest record. Only could be Dutchess County, 1934-35. He painted a lot and drew in plein air, so he was actually out in the countryside where he found this person. I'm not quite sure, but it's a tiny little watercolor, but lovely, and tells you what you really want to know about an afternoon in the countryside. He traveled. These were done in 1931. He traveled to the South. He was in South Carolina, went around through Arkansas. He often traveled with his sister. And these were sketching trips. These are 2 children he found in a town somewhere else, and there's no other history of it. They were just done by the side of the road early in an afternoon, and I'm not sure the children ever saw the final watercolors, but they are of that period, and they're very much about American regional work and art. Beautifully observed, two young people. Very much like people that you also know about, Charles Sheeler and the Precisionists, he painted objects as art. So these are essentially industrial buildings, and there are a number of these watercolors. They're not all fascinating, but they were just of a type and style that were well thought of in America in the 1930s, and he was certainly part of that American regionalist, ruralist school. Like Thomas Hart Benton, who did a number of works like this, and even more sort of staged and huge murals we'll see in a second, he knew about Benton, who was known as the Little Giant of the Ozarks, and painted the famous Indiana murals, which you've probably all seen too many reproductions of. Very few entries into the world of stylized work or abstraction. This is probably the most abstract thing that he actually worked on. There are three very small paper sketches, 11 by 7 inches, of the elements of a ship. On the left you can see the vent coming out, the smokestack in the center. On the right there's a little banquette, and just an element of the ship itself, done on shipboard, I think going to Europe. He went on a trip in 36 and 37 to Egypt. He went from there to Germany, and he wrote a very interesting paper on the German Reich's artistic program for the country, which he researched as an American, speaking very good German, which helped him later in the war. But it's a fascinating paper that I think has rarely been seen, and I found a copy in his files, and he filed it with the Treasury Department, and it made its way to the intelligence services about how the Germans were rolling out a Nazi art program in terms of training artists in work. Europe, I think a little earlier in the 30s, sometime men unloading things. Again, look at this as part of the mural world, things painted in large scale. The world was a socialist place. Eugene Debs, socialists and labor unions were becoming very popular, and many images of these went through the mural projects of the Treasury, but also many artists took these subjects. Whether they were positive about labor or negative remains to be seen. Many of them show people under obviously incredible burdens carrying things up very narrow planks in an artist's rendering of what may have been unfair to the workers, or certainly unfair to the wages they were getting at the time, which I'll get to in a minute. Same trip, 37, you see on the right, he signed the work in the Lifesaver there, Olin Dows, 1937, and there are 4 huddled women with one child, and I have a feeling that they're Muslims, and he was going to or from Egypt on a ferry, probably from Greece or from Turkey or somewhere, because everybody is pretty well covered up and look like they're a little bit cold going across the Mediterranean. A deeply emotional image given what's going on today in the Mediterranean. So this was nearly a century ago. As I said, he watercolored almost everywhere, but he rarely went to cities. He didn't like New York. His mother lived there, which may have been the reason. He did live in Washington, though, and she also lived there, so there were times, but he didn't really spend a lot of time in New York, except when he was at the Art Students League, 28, 29, and 30. And he spent most of his life here, and after he married in 1950, he went to Chile, spent a lot of time in Santiago, well after the war, with his wife, who was a Chilean diplomat, who lived here. It's one of the few views that we have of New York City, from Brooklyn, from the yards, looking back over at the towers. Back in Dutchess County, another farm near Pine Plains. I think this is outside across from what's called the Mishomic Preserve now, so up near Tissing Mountain. Just another good view from that period. and a church. This would remind you of anyone, particularly a man named Birchfield and any of the American regionalists who worked in the 20s and 30s, very much in this format. Things were very focused. There's a central image of the church. It's made bigger by the fact that the paper constrains it. It becomes a large, almost overwhelming image, but beautifully rendered and wonderful colors and these very stylized, again, trees known throughout America and copied by many artists as a way of using watercolor to express leaves and branches. And back in Germany, I think this was a beer garden. This was this trip in 37 or 38 when he wrote his report. Clearly recalls an American artist named Prendergast, Charles Prendergast, who was a Boston artist a generation ahead of him, but he certainly knew of his work and had been to Boston many times. This is just a summer scene. It's not quite finished. There's little bits of white were left there on purpose, somehow to highlight the figures and the dress and the cloak of the lady and the things that you see there. So it's finished, but not as highly finished as some of the others, but it's meant to have that same effect. And Prendergast did that with paint on many of his works. And here again, Glenburn, these backfields. This is a little bit later than the lithograph with all the little zebras running around, but pay attention to the leaves and the trees. This will come back again. In fact, it's one of the main features of the Rhinebeck Post Office. There's an image I'll show you there in just a second. And lastly, I just thought I'd show this because it goes with the church, but this is probably the most complete and finished house. I have a feeling this is somewhere near Tivoli. I've never actually found the house, and we've looked around, but hard to decide. It may or may not exist anymore. But this is where clearly he was at home. He was most comfortable doing this kind of work, sitting on a stool by the side of the road, doing the watercolors. He would then bring them back, sometimes in full scale, and finish them, or he would bring back the sketches and do it again completely from memory and from the sketches that he'd taken. But this is probably the strongest image of him for this area that I certainly know of in terms of his work. Abstraction, as I said, and the Cubists were far from his main interest. He did try, not with great success, but this is a proto-image of a Cubist still life with the bottle on the right in particular. You see the gray and the tan and the white. It comes out of a Braque painting, so he was struggling with some of these ways to get out of his realist tendencies and to get away from his training. He never really embraced it. The Treasury programs never particularly embraced it, and I'll read you a passage from his interview after the war about the programs and the role of abstraction and what we would call modernism in that program. It was very small. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the Treasury Public Works of Art program. I am by no means an expert, nor am I planning to become one. I know a few facts, and I've read 100 pages about it, but it's not a field I think I'm going to pursue. There are many books. There's a lot written about it. If you're interested, a lot of the material, including, I just spoke to a lady here, that Morgenthau's papers. He was the Treasury Secretary. He really funded these programs before there was anything called the WPA. The WPA, as we'll see, was a competitive program. It really was not the Treasury. The Treasury was the Treasury, and the Treasury ran the post office, which is why we have these murals in the post offices. They were really nothing to do with the WPA. They were sponsored separately. Eventually, they were folded in right before the war began into a program, but the Treasury programs had all basically expired by 1940-41. Too much to read. It's slightly boring. There are a few things I will talk about here. The department programs, there were three main ones, all of which Olin was involved in. He was asked by President Roosevelt to help serve on them, and a man named Forbes Watson was one of the people involved, and a man named Bruce, who was a lawyer and lived in Washington. He'd been in the Philippines for many years. He was well-traveled, well-spoken, and very amusing, and he's the one who headed it up. And as a group, they were probably 5 or 6 layers away from Morgenthau, but of course Olin knew a person that was pretty important, Franklin Roosevelt. So when the president asked, he said yes, and he was in Washington where he lived and could work on these programs. very quickly, the public PWAP was the first one. It lasted for 6 months. It's relatively extraordinary because the fees that were offered to the artists were 25 cents an hour. What they achieved in 6 months, I mean, imagine trying to organize this. 3,700 artists were given commissions, 10,000 works of art appeared, many of them lost, at a cost of $1,300,000 over the 6 months. Most of the works were done in schools, or they were made on easels and delivered to schools, or they were delivered to government offices, offices of congressmen, offices of senators. So they're probably scattered around public and federal buildings and departments of government now, if they're known at all. They were recorded poorly, and there were some images taken of most of them, but many of those have disappeared and are lost. The section on painting and sculpture fine arts was probably Olin's greatest area of achievement. It went from 34 almost to 43, about 1,400 contracts. That was $2.5 million over the 9 years, and those works are the ones like the ones in the post office here. Most of those came out of that area. And he was commissioned, obviously, to do 2 post offices, because you know Rhinebeck and Hyde Park, so having friends in high places isn't bad, even if you're in the government, part of the people, part of the group that's appropriating the money. He still got the work, and he did them in 38 and 39, and I'll show you some pictures of them. The last Treasury Relief project, relief is the operative word, relief meaning that you were an artist that had no income, that you needed something to do. The first 2 programs had relief as part of it, but anyone could compete. So you could submit a design for a post office or a treasury building or a public building, but you didn't have to be in need, i.e. on welfare without any kind of income at all. And as I told you, the first group there, 25 cents an hour, was pretty good. That was near enough the minimum wage. By 1940, it had gotten to 40 cents an hour. And then in 1941, obviously we went to war, and it stopped. There was no reason to have people working in these programs because they were offered an introduction to join the Army or the Navy, and many of them did. I'm going to read a couple of things before we leave this, and this may be a little bit difficult because these are from live transcripts of a talk. These little quotes are from a talk that he made here in Hyde Park to the Hyde Park Historical Society, probably late 1941, when this post office was opened. The president was here, they were all here, Pearl Harbor hadn't been bombed, and he gave a little talk to the then Historical Society. I haven't quite found out where it is. But anyway, let me just talk to you a little bit. This is about, I'm going to do something else first, because this is about the murals themselves. And I think I'll just finish up with the WPA and the relief projects. And this is about the PWAP. So this is the first one of these in 1933-34. Insofar as the PWAP was part of the whole project for the Treasury, they had floated this notion of a minimum wage of $0.25 an hour. But there was also this announcement of a series of cutbacks of personnel. Of course, this occasioned organization picketing, particularly of the Whitney Museum, by the artists. Talks with Mrs. Force, who was properly named. And it was a sense of uneasiness that it was a good idea and a vested interest was created in artists who saw this possibility falling by the wayside, and the desirability of gaining some sense of continuity and some income, and a deeper involvement in the vested occasional picketing and marches. Plus something wholly new for artists, which is a feature of the 1930s in a way, which is organization of any kind. Artists had never really been organized into a group, and they went and picketed to get these programs approved so that they could apply and have some income in the third year of the Depression. Let's see, sorry. When the WPA appeared, which was the famous Works Progress Administration, which you all know, which spent $70 million and employed thousands of people at 40 cents an hour, it created a direct competition with the Treasury, which I think some people have written that may have indeed been organized by Roosevelt to create a more competitive edge. Most of the projects that were done in the Treasury, but not the WPA, because it did writers theater people, anything creative. The Treasury was all about people that made artwork. It was nothing to do with writing or any theatrical things or performances or anything else. And they're often confused. So at the time that the WPA was created, and this I quote from Olin Dows from this, these are some interviews that he made after the war. Bruce was able to get our original relief appropriations away from the WPA. That was before the WPA art program started. Later, the WPA saw no reason why another organization should have relief money handled exactly the way they were handling it. So an administrative order was put out saying that all money was to be turned into the central WPA office, and they would continue to finish the projects. We all felt very strongly that we were committed to the individuals and to handling the program in a certain way. We were backed by our officials, up to Morgenthau. So I went to see the president about this matter. I called Mrs. Roosevelt. She said, "Come to lunch. I'll see if you can see the president after lunch." I did. I saw him for a few minutes, showed him what we'd done, and told him briefly what the problem was. He wrote a hieroglyphic on a little piece of paper about the size of a hat check and said, "Take it to the director of the budget." I'd forgotten who he was then, so I trotted around and handed it in, and the matter was all smoothed out. We also got our next appropriation to finish the programs. We didn't expand, but we finished what we'd started, and that's the only time I ever went to FDR or anything. I wouldn't presume to bother him because he was a family friend. And this is just a quick thing I wanted to talk a little bit about realism and abstraction. I've shown you what Olin did, and those of you who know any of the WPA work, you know there was not a lot of room there for people who eventually became more contemporary or, very modern artists. They were somewhat left out, but people like Philip Guston did do work for the WPA in public buildings, and there's some famous now lost murals in the in the airport in Newark, New Jersey. So if you were a realist like Reginald Marsh, the fact that he felt that strongly about a functional matter and getting it right was understandably a stimulus to him. He had about 10 assistants, and they accomplished the Customs House in New York City, the murals in the giant open space, which are quite beautiful. There was room for every kind. The only thing we didn't have was abstract murals. We probably were all slightly prejudiced against it. First, it would have been very difficult to install publicity-wise in a federal public building. Also, sketches were not submitted by abstract artists. I don't remember any competition with an abstract solution sent in. I don't think even somebody as partially abstract as Stuart Davis ever sent in sketches. He may have, but I don't remember sketches submitted by him. We did do a number of jobs that were, well, abstract in the sense of bare outlines. A corridor for the War Department was abstract in the sense that it used blueprints as a basis and was design-oriented. It was very handsome. We also did maps and symbols, but as far as abstract expressionism, we didn't. So now let me go back to this. I think this is basically pretty self-explanatory what went on with the WPA. It was just a different program. It was competitive, and what I'm talking about and what Olin worked on was the other side of the house. Just a quick run through with some of the mural ideas before we get to the post offices. Rivera was obviously well known because of the Rockefeller murals, which included a portrait of Stalin, which was later taken down by Mr. Rockefeller. He married a woman named Frida Kahlo, an also famous Mexican painter, and they were together at the time that Olin Dows went down there in 1929 and spent a few months with them. So he was very influenced by what Rivera was doing. On the left, you see it looks like people supervising at the bottom looking at drawings, and Rivera's up there on the top row with his back to you working on one of the murals at Rockefeller Center. Rivera was also a bit over the top. Some of the murals have this sort of scary sense to them. This thing is 74 feet wide. It lives in San Francisco. It's an enormous wall painting, and it is, as he says below, my mural, which I'm painting now, is about the marriage of the artistic expression of the North and the South of the continent. That is all. But he was going to tell you all about it in this painting, which is a very, very large, huge work of art with lots going on with Mexican things, and I won't go into all the details, but it's got so much stuff in it, it's almost, you can't really even read it. Monumental and crowded. Benton, this is from later 1960. I'm just showing you it as a type of painting and a type of artwork. This is the famously known as sort of the caravans going over the Rockies. There are thousands of these in America. Benton kind of invented this mode of doing them. You have oxen pulling the wagons over the things, and everybody's got guns, and they're out conquering the West with children and everything in the sides of it. This is a detail from President Truman's library in Missouri. And this is the last thing that Benton did in 1974 in Missouri, in Joplin City Hall. It's about 14 feet wide. It's quite a big work. But see, nothing has really changed. This tradition of murals goes back from really the beginning of the century through the Mexicans, through the Works Project, through the Treasury, through everything else, and it finally pretty much came to an end as a monumental method of making art in the 1970s. The Mexicans, as I said, were pretty good at this sort of stuff. Here's another giant mural of a horse by Siqueiros. This was later, he did this later as a commission in 1957. I just thought I'd show it to you. It's 15 feet tall, it's 245 feet long. So there's a lot of it, including this. So it's a little overwhelming again. So back to this sort of too many figures, too many people, everybody jumping in. And I think this is the kind of stuff that Olin was aware of, earlier versions of this. This one is actually even more crowded than the ones in the 20s and the 30s. But just to give you a sense of overwhelming scale and what I think he tried to avoid in these post office murals and the work that he did and commissioned. Back again, a final one of the Benton. This is the full scale of the Benton mural, 32 feet by 19. It's sort of a giant thing which presides over the entrance to the presidential library. And again, the sort of thing that I think he was happy to have a go at not doing or not repeating. So that's just a little background. This is the building that you probably know if you've been recently to Rhinebeck. This is the post office he did there. It was commissioned in 1937, built in 38, and dedicated in 39. And he did the work there before he came to do this post office in 1940-41. It's a series of murals, and you'll notice the trees and the leaves have come right out of that drawing from down the road when he was about 10 or 15 years younger. There's a boy bathing here. You're probably hard to read these as Landsman Kill. It's the mill and swimming hole. The Beekman Mill at Vanderburg Cove. Oil and canvas, they were done over there. And over the doors, which are the parts that are really very difficult to photograph. Even in this post office, I've struggled with images for those, but I'll go through the ones that I have. But this is just a quick look at the Rhinebeck post office before I start on the one across the street. Let's see. Another scene from Rhinebeck, Clermont, the boat, the Clermont is very far in the back. You can't see it to the right. August 7th, 1807, from New York to Tivoli, New York. So there's a whaler at the Kingston dock, which is down right in the center with the men carrying things on it. You see the sail behind the man standing. That's a sail on the river. They're carrying things onto the whaling boat and carrying oil off. So it was still a whaling port, certainly Poughkeepsie was in Kingston, and these boats were coming up the river quite frequently, even then. And lastly, a detail from corn shucking. This is just a farm detail. It's not a very good photograph. Some of these are really, unless there's a really professional photographer up on trestles, you're not going to get good pictures of them. They have not been well cared for. They're all in pretty good need of a clean because they've been up for almost 80 years and no one's paid much attention. They've survived very well because they were beautifully made, oil and canvas, and they were mounted on plaster. This is a painting that Olin did that never showed up anywhere, but I have a feeling it relates to one of the two post offices. It was done on board. It's actually a painting, and the painting looks like it's set into what looks like into a wall of oak panels. He painted the whole thing, so it was a maquette, or it was a study. What's interesting about the subject is if you look at the figure in the white in the middle, there's a mandorla around his head. So the implication clearly is this was a secular, modern-day Jesus sitting on the lawn at Vanderbilt's reading to a group of children. He never wrote much about it. I've never seen anything else like it. It was just one of these unique studies that he did at a point in time. I'm going to read a couple of things quickly from the talk that I said he gave to the Historical Society about the murals that he made here and in Rhinebeck. I'm just going to give you a few quotes. Finally, I'll explain what I tried to do, the intellectual and emotional background of the conception. In both murals, I've tried to tell the story of the towns, past and present, against the background of the land we all know and love. In a sense, they supplement each other. One Rhinebeck emphasizing the 18th century, and the other Hyde Park, the 19th and 20th. Both start with Henry Hudson's Half Moon. There's the building that you know well. Let's see if I've gone. I'll stay there. In both, I've drawn on those simple activities that bind our lives to the past and to each other. Tilling and clearing of fields, growing, catching and preparing our food, building our houses, losing and leaving them, eating and drinking, exchanging goods and services, working, playing, talking, and worshiping. In my lifetime, the state road has broadened, straightened out, armored its surface with concrete, collected a retinue of signs, hot dog stands, and gasoline stations. The winding King's Highway has become Route 9, artery of heavy luxury and business traffic that has an influence on us all, both directly and indirectly. Some of these ideas are pictorial. Even when they aren't, they form the skeleton of both murals. Yet these epoch-making changes are subordinate to the landscape and to our rural activities. There is a hopeful and healthy continuity to faith and living that controls these innovations. For the mural in Hyde Park, Miss Helen Reynolds and Mr. Sterling Bird helped me a great deal in finding my sources. Besides discussions, I read what literature was available in the Roosevelt and Adrian's libraries. So he spent time here and in Roosevelt's house, this is before there was an FDR library, looking through documents that he had. Roosevelt was a great collector of local history. He had about 1,000 volumes in his library of everything to do with the local everything, agriculture, environment, history, images, photographs. He collected them all for years and years. Some literature I found particularly interesting was the domestic narrative, a biography of Samuel Bard by his son-in-law, John McVicker, the rector of St. James. And a book well worth reading. It gives you a sense of the greatness of the two Bards, both as men of the world and citizens of this community. There is an uprightness, a decency and fineness in the book that makes the father and son humanly memorable. It is the tale of an accomplishment which is one of the outstanding ones of our country. The example of these two doctors should not be forgotten by us or by our children. Like the Bards, the Roosevelts have touched the community in many simple ways. It is quite fitting that the president should be shown chopping trees, ice boating, talking over school problems, and I'll show you these in just a minute, and acting as a host. Like the great Americans of the 18th century, he has affected his community continuously. His touch is visibly constructive. We have schools, libraries, trees, and richer soil as a result of his touch. The social consciousness that made the Livingstons and the Bards improve local breeds of cattle and experiment with fertilizers have become in our larger world the reforestation and soil conservation programs, the agricultural experimental stations, and the other social programs initiated and pushed by the president. I think that very quickly on the technique, and I'm going to skip over these because I think I really said it, so I don't need to show them again. On this drawing, which is in the Bard College collection, the post office, which that building is stone, and it was taken from the Bard estate, which is basically near where Vanderbilt's is right now, Bard's Landing. That's all still there. It's part of, I think, the greater Vanderbilt property. This is a stone building, and it's based on the wooden building, which is in the right center of this little sketch. You can see it up in the top. It was made of clapboard down by the river, and I think as long ago perished and been burned down. I've talked really about these. These are the themes that I just read about, so I'll go across these theme of the panels. And here, just one last thing about how they were made. Excursions into history like this are part of the preliminary study. After the reading and the talking, the proposed subjects are jotted down chronologically, then they're sketched in pencil and later developed in color on the inch scale model, which you can see in the library here. The model, I think, is at the President's Library. I've never seen it. There's a model of the entire post office showing all the murals and where he was going to put them. Next, they're placed in a magic lantern, which enlarges them on paper the size of the actual murals. And that's done by putting little pinholes in the sketches, putting them in front of a light and projecting them on a screen. As these images are larger than where they're coming from, they project the image that he has done like an Italian cartoon. And that's how he did it and made them larger from the sketches that he did. These studies are known as cartoons. Detailed landscape figures and costume drawings are used to develop the cartoons. There wasn't sufficient room for all the details that might have made a part of the pictures. I found it very difficult to leave things out. I wish the post office walls had been at least twice as big. The cartoons are transferred to canvas, specially prepared with a semi-absorbent pinkish paint. All the panels are underpainted in an olive green and then in full color, but sufficiently thinly so that much of the green shows through. When finished, it took Mr. Crittenden and me about 2 days to install them. Finally, the small panels had to be painted on the walls, and these are the ones that I've struggled with to try and show you. This is the first one in there. The small panels are like this. They're over the doors. They're about 9 inches high, and they're 30 or 40 inches wide. They're very, A, dirty, and B, hard to get at and hard to see even if you're on the floor, and quite difficult to photograph. And that's the first one coming in. So let me walk you through. This is, I've gotten, I think, how am I doing on time?
A little more.
I have more?
A little more.
Little more, okay, a little more. Well, we're almost there. Let's go through these relatively. Since some of you know the post office, this is on the left when you come in behind the door. It's the Half Moon Henry Hudson, his ship, the famous ship that floated up the river. As you all know, there's not a lot of wind, and even that ship, which is 80 feet long, couldn't sail up the Hudson, so it came up on the tide. High tide, they'd pull up the anchor, and they'd float up quarter of a mile, half a mile, the tide would turn around, they'd drop the anchor. And if they got too close to either shore, somebody would come out and shoot an arrow at them, so they had to spend a lot of time staying in the channel and dropping the anchor and pulling it up. So there was a long trip to get up here. So this is at Crum Elbow Point. And this is the overdoor right next to it, and I don't have a good color image. Samuel Bard was very cross at an innkeeper named Jabez Miller, because he was going to name his tavern Hyde Park, which is the name of Bard's house. So there was a fight, and this is sort of a humorous example of him with his sign there of Hyde Park above his tavern on the road. This is panel 3, 1740. Jacob of Stoutenburg, his sons and his slaves are here cutting down trees in a huge effort, which was mainly the work of most agrarians in this valley, was cutting down trees and digging up stumps. A lot of time spent doing both of them. That's a sketch from the overdoor. Here it is in color. Not a wonderful reproduction, but it's all right. There's a little house in the background there, which was their cottage, built in the 1740s and now long gone. And the King's Highway, then a grassy wagon road passed in front through the. Here's sawing again, and you can see this is the other side of the same panel, them sawing up logs. Rocks and roots, lots of rocks and roots. Panel 4, this is just one to the right. About 1795, Richard de Cantillon, I don't know who he was, Tobias Stoutenburg's son-in-law, is supervising the men on the dock, so you can see the ship in the back there. There's a loading and unloading. They're unloading rum, sugar, and molasses from the West Indian packet ships. In the front, the man and the women are fixing shad nets for Shad Row, who run up the river once a year. And the logs on the right are being pulled. I think I've got to detail this. Let's see. The logs on the right, you can see the logs in the river there, and there was a logging operation where they cut the trees, threw them into the water, dragged them to the shore, and put them on the ships to take down to New York. And there's a young man shad fishing with that pole, thing looks like a pole with a net, and it's on a square rig thing, and you put it in the water and they would get the shad to swim into them. And another detail, there's the little better shot of the packet ship in the back, and the logs rolling in the front, in the water right in front, in the sort of center right side of the image there, and a little bird sitting here on top of the shad nets. Panel 3 and 4 just together. This is in the corner of the post office, and you can see how they just abut each other. They don't really transition, they just are just painted and installed. So there's the one I just showed you, with Stoutenburg, and then the one with the shad nets. Another overdoor, Dr. Hosack, who was a professor of natural history at Columbia, with Miss Martineau. They're out driving. Behind is a whaler, another whaler taking on water. And the property, I think, is where Vanderbilt's house is now, right there down on that point. Dr. Hosack bought this from Bard and landscaped it in the 1820s. Hosack is best known probably as the doctor who attended Alexander Hamilton after he shot Aaron Burr. Again, the same thing, I'm just showing you a little more detail, driving the gig past the rock with the ship there. Panel 6, late 1780s, Doctors John and Samuel Bard are examining their new Italian melons, which they were very proud of and had planted here to great effect and I think quite a lot of profit. Here is the same one in color. What's more important probably for the Dutchess County and for the whole valley is what's going on at the right, which is apple picking, which is a much bigger industry than melons ever became. And there's the guys in the apple trees pulling down the apples at the same time as the melons are becoming ripe probably in September. Both were friends of Franklin. They lived here. Obviously, they were very involved with his church, with his parish, with the land, Bard College. I mean, you can go on and on. This is the same house, the Bard Hosack farm, or the red house. This is John Bard's house, so you see it's a little closer up of what the post office actually looks like in the middle there. I tried to blow it up a little bit with a little waterfall in front of it, and that's the model for this post office. Another drawing, there's a color image, which is mine, which is not very good, but this is actually a better delineation of what the subject is. Samuel Bard was a doctor, giving first aid to William, who was burnt in the fire of the house behind. You see the house going up in flames. His son-in-law, John McVicker, is holding the lantern, and he was the one who was involved very much with this church and this parish. He was actually, I think he was a rector. Here it is in color. Badly taken, I apologize. It was a sunny day, and there was no way, even on a ladder, I think, to get a good image. So I hope someone will have a very good high-quality camera and go and take some images of these. And this is, again, keep going to the right, and the next overdoor, also hard to photograph. This is the grist mill, Dickinson's, the grist mill, and a sawmill, two of the industrial activities that went on in Hyde Park, which Olin recorded from some early drawings, and I think the buildings are all now gone. And another one of that in color you can see the logs here in the front, so that's where the sawmill, everybody was stacking up logs to get them cut, and the grist mill is on the left, I think there in that white building. And they're a little bit closer, so you can see a horse in the middle distance in front of that building on the right, and some people working on the left. And now 10 and 11, we're halfway through, we're at the end of where the post office windows are now, and there's a winter scene here. And you'll see we're going to go around the corner to another summer scene, and there's one in the corner that I'll show you in a minute. This is panel 10 on the left, the winter scene. It was late for the Friends meeting at Crum Elbow, 1797. The houses there are the Benjamin Shelton house by a family named Wilbur, and another Shelton house. Let's see if we've got a better view of that. That's just another not very good photograph of it, but it gives you a sense of. There we are, and that's bigger. So there's the boy running to get to the Friends meeting, which is not in the picture. They're just the Shelton and the two Shelton houses and the Wilbur house in this scene, somewhere near where we are now. I think many of these images are based on things that he had found, early drawings or early reports about activity in Hyde Park itself. Another overdoor here. This is a young Franklin Roosevelt chopping a tree, and I think there's a better one of this, if I can make it a little bit bigger. And there's some horses, and they're basically clearing for what was modern scientific forestation, which was the subject that Roosevelt was quite passionate about. He was passionate about tree farms and about clearing land, and it looks like with that axe, it's going to take him quite a long time to chop down that tree. There's a little bit better image of it. Lots of wood, as you can see, it just comes over and over again, wood and sawing and pulling things up out of the ground. And that is at the end, so we've gotten now to the far window there, and we're coming around the sides, so I'm almost done. And I can answer any questions that I can, but I apologize for the images. I think one day we'll try again, maybe with a better result. Getting to the end, the corner, Reuben Sherwood, Archibald Rogers, and Augustus Cowman, discussing the plans of your church here. So that's the church in the middle there, and Cowman's on the ground, I think, with the plans. He was actually the architect. I don't know who Rogers was, and the Reverend Reuben Sherwood was obviously the rector of the church while this was being built. So I suppose that's the chapel. Is that what we're looking at, or is that the church? Maybe that's the church. So it's not facing Route 9, it's on the other side. And at the right was the sexton, Richard Jenkins, carrying a pot of paint to the church. Now, why that was significant, I don't know, but that's what history relates. So, and there's the church with Cowman in the looking at the drawings. And there's Mr. Rogers, and he's got a big wad of papers in his pocket. So I'm not quite clear who's the architect and who's not. But anyway, it would seem that the architect would be the one with all the papers in his pocket. Then around the corner, panel 13 of 19, a weekly Saturday trip to exchange produce for goods. You can't see in the background, but the wagon train goes all the way back through the back. It curls around to the right and disappears in the distance. So there were many people coming down the same road all at the same time. Another just enlargement of that. The horses and the carriages, all painted in this very mural, very Olin Dows kind of style, with that green background that he talked about coming through all the panels to the forefront. Panel 14 is over the other door, and there was so much post office stuff I couldn't even take a bad picture of it. So you just have to imagine the North and South Irish worked together until too many fights developed. So it's about the railroad and tracks. So you can take that as read, and the image you can imagine. This is probably the most famous one that's reproduced, which is this incredible fishing shot of taking pike out of the river for the caviar industry, which became a big deal in this river. The fact that the fish is that large, maybe a fisherman's tale, but it's certainly an extraordinary image. The fish were being cut. They dragged them up out of the river. They were enormous. They took them right to the beach and monstrously cut them up and took out the caviar and sold it. Abe Atkins, who's the fellow in the middle of the picture, was later drowned, according to the sources here, when the Mary Powell, which I guess is that boat, capsized in the river. Another image of that is an enormous tail you see coming back. I mean, the fish must be 18, 20 feet long, which is an awful lot of caviar. And for a river this far up, I've never seen anything that size. They probably don't exist anymore, but I suppose 1870, they were still coming up this far to spawn from the open ocean. Now, I'm getting to the end. And another view of this fish, there's a wonderful wire which is part of the net with this big weight on it, which is being flung around because the fish is so large it's actually pulled the net right out of the water, as well as the weights that kept it down. And let's see, and one more, there's the two men on the boat. They were being pulled out of the water, and you see the weights here in the water in the front. They're just being pulled by the size of the fish that's just dragging all of them along the river bottom. Panel 16, we're getting towards the end. This is a winter scene. Buckhout and Roosevelt, J. Roosevelt, I guess was the cousin, discussed the icicle sailboat. And in the middle distance, you see another one of the ice boats there, which is called the Hawk, which is a small ice boat built for FDR, probably around the turn of the century. So this is set 1895, 96. And it's a very small panel, but rather well done. I've never seen ice boats in the Hudson. I've never seen it frozen that much that you could actually do that, but this is 100 and something years ago. And right to the end, this one you see when you walk out of the post office, the Union Corners racetrack. I'm not sure where Union Corners is. Maybe somebody here can tell us. James Roosevelt is in his cart here with the big round wheels, calling to his friend Daniel Wigg in the blue coat. So they're trotting all the way around. You can see in the backside they're coming all the way around. It's a big circular course. And the other side in the middle distance, and besides that little bit of a tower, which I've got a little bit of a blow up, is Martin Van Buren and his former Secretary of the Navy, James K. Paulding. So 1850. Here's a blow up of the lady you just saw there on the right with the two children. And the peanut wagon contains yellow cans and a bottle of Daniel Wigg's World Bone Liniment, equally good for man and beast. So I think he was particularly not concerned who bought it as long as they bought it. So, and here, just to the right, I've been trying to just take different views of it because it's very hard to see. You see the two sulkies going by with the big wheels in a race on the racetrack itself, and then the two children right here in the middle distance with a little bit of the peanuts and the liniment in the front there. And then just another one to show you Van Buren is right behind the white fence there, standing there with these other figures. And last 2 weeks, we got a little stray dog named Oliver, and he's in the middle of that. So he has survived as a little white dog running along the side there right in front of the two horses. And that's the end there. There he is. And sorry, these are repetitive, but I'm trying to get a little better color, and it's one of the best of all of the murals. Panel 18, again, apologies, no color image of it. Couldn't take one that day. The sun was completely in the face of the camera. And this is a picnic at the President's Cottage. I'm not sure where that was, whether it must have been on that estate somewhere. I just don't know the building itself. And it was for the King and Queen of England, George VI and Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, then current Queen's mother. And they came here for a visit. They were also looking for money. They were looking for help with the war. And it was a very famous meeting. They've actually made a movie or two. But this is the lunch on the dais. You can see them all sitting up there with Mr. and Mrs. Morgenthau and Governor Herbert Lehman, the King and Queen, the Roosevelts. No one quite has figured out who this figure is under the parasol here in the front. I have a feeling it's probably Olin's mother, but we're not sure. It's certainly not Mrs. Roosevelt, because she would have been up on the dais with the King and Queen and not down here with the family, but that could well be her. And lastly, this is the final panel, and I'll be done in about 2 minutes. Panel 19, which shows clearly Roosevelt there looking at a plan, and the plan was for the high school. And the seller of the land was Benjamin Haviland, and it became Haviland School before there was an Arlington High School. And this was 1939, so this was really on the eve of him painting these murals here in this post office. So this was a current event, I guess, and it's right by the door as you go out. And you see there are the people, Raymond Hill, Samuel Matthews, you may know some of these names, Frank Botsford, Arthur White, and so forth. There's a little better color impression of it with his dog looking at the chickens in the foreground, the little black dog. And that's that. I think that's all I can say. It's probably enough. Good.
Chip's available to take some questions from you. Just raise your hand, and John can come around with the mic.
Yes, could you tell us what the material is in the Hyde Park post office? Is it wood panel?
No, it's oil and canvas, and then it's mounted on a plaster wall. So conservation is going to be a challenge. So they were quite thick canvases, heavily gessoed, painted on with regular oil paint, and were then essentially mounted right onto the wall in the framing that's actually still there. I mean, the framing that was made for the panels around it was set up for them to be put in, so they were exactly measured. And I think they'll come off the plaster wall if anybody ever cares to take them off and conserve them, or they could be done in place.
Thank you.
There's one in the back, John.
Mentioned that he went to Mexico, Olin Dows, and We just recently, in the last year or so, went to see a lecture, a touring lecture of Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. And now you mentioned that in the beginning. And a lot of his work, and anyone can see it in Rockefeller Center. It's all over. It's part of the Works Project. If you go in Rockefeller Center, you can see is very similar to the style of Olin Dows. And I'm amazed at it. When I look at it, you almost could see a little bit of difference, you know, the influence. And I wondered if you'd done any research or anything, because that was such a big issue in the 30s with Diego Rivera was in Mexico, with communism was starting, all the public socialistic issues that were going on. What was the tie and the influence, or was it none?
I don't think so. Olin was neither, he was apolitical. I mean, he happened to be a friend of the Roosevelts, but he never was a politician of any kind. He worked in the government. He was in the army. He fought bravely for us throughout the European theater. I don't think he had any particular left leanings at all. As a young man, which you saw him with his straw hat in 1929, he went down to have fun. He was 26, 27 years old. He went with some friends. They ran into these crazy people, Rivera, Siqueiros, Kahlo, and it was a party. I mean, they had a lot of fun. It was quite a, they fought unmercifully, Siqueiros and Rivera, who were both men. Then he and she fought. Rivera fought with Frida Kahlo hourly. I mean, it was a great drama all the time. So I think they had quite a good time, but he did come back with a lot of the influence of those big, giant, somewhat crowded murals, and even some of the ones that he's done here are a little overpopulated. So it sort of stuck in his mind, and it became the great inspiration for mural painting pretty much all over the United States. Not because of, I think, political leanings or communism, just because they were the biggest ones that anybody had done. And Rivera was a master of making these giant things. I mean, they were as large as anything Michelangelo ever accomplished, but they were all over the United States, so they were visible. Chicago, California, Rockefeller Center, I mean, they were everywhere. And Siqueiros, the same thing with the giant horses and all that kind of stuff. They were more than readily available, and people said, wow, can I do that too? And I think they did. Well, people wouldn't have been trained if they hadn't been part of one of these WPA or one of these treasury programs, because that's where they got the opportunity. And there are not that many giant walls around that you can paint on, especially even at 40 cents an hour, that's better than no cents, but actually the commissions are things that are far and few between. So.
I think it's pretty amazing, and correct me if I'm wrong, that these panels have not been photographed in color for documentation. Thanks to you, we do have them, but it's amazing to me that none of them have been done for the records, really.
No, I think the post office is probably not interested at this point, and they have black and white, you know, they have things, and the sketches I showed you, many of them are at Bard, the actual hand-drawn sketches which belonged to whoever he gave them to. I mean, I have no idea whether they were all one collection or not. And there's some things in the Franklin Roosevelt Library about the libraries, but more documents than images.
The other thing, I was doing a little reading, and I was amazed that FDR had his hand in the topics that were going to be painted. He told Rhinebeck that he wanted such and such, and he told Hyde Park that he wanted such and such. So he was pretty much directing what was going to be on these panels.
Yes, he had a willing painter, a close family friend.
Not much.
Good,
Chip,
thank you.
Thank you very much for
Thank
being
you.
part of our Fireside series.
Thank you very much.
Just to note, many of us knew Debbie.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, our daughter took writing lessons from Debbie, and she was terrified.
She was terrified.
Scared the devil out of her. Yeah. But now we know a lot more about Olin, thanks to you, Chip. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Chippa will be joining us for some refreshments, so you'll have a chance to maybe ask some questions that you didn't have time to ask. I do want to give some thanks to the people who have helped put this program together. As always, John and Gloria Golden, who are my co-chairs, Randy Soden and John Bickford, who is walking around with the mic, who have been helping us with our AV needs. Herb Sweet is in the back, and he's been recording this presentation, and it will be on YouTube. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Herb, but I think they can go to the website, the church's website, which is on the back of your program, and then you will see the directions for YouTube, so you can go there, just follow those directions. So you will be able to look at it. And of course, Joanne Lown, who is coordinating the reception for us. And like any event, there are always a lot of volunteers who help put these things together. So I do want to thank all those folks who have been helping me with that. So big thank you to all those folks. There are a couple of announcements. Also on the back of your program, you will see the schedule for the upcoming chats. If any of you saw the press release that had the future chats listed and the dates, it may have been wrong because we have had to make some changes in the content. We just flipped two of the lectures. So what you have on the back of your program is correct. So we do have on February 1st, we have what we're calling Flashback 40, and it's a look at Hyde Park in 1978 as they were looking ahead to plan ahead for their town. So it might be kind of interesting to see what the thinking was at that point in time. And then to comment on that will be Harvey Fladd and our own John Golden. The next one in March will be the Hudson Valley Bridges with Kathy Burke. And then the last one will be the Japanese internment, which is the result of the research of Linda Boucher and Al Vink. So those are the three remaining ones that we have to look forward to. And if there is any cancellation, I will notify the radio stations that is also on the back of your program, and I'll try to put a recording on the church answering machine. We do have one last announcement, and it's actually very special and maybe more important than the rest of them. We have a very special birthday celebration. John Golden, who I have the pleasure to work with, has just celebrated his 94th birthday. And we haven't been able to tell, but we think that John is the longest parishioner at St. James, all of his 94 years. So if you would join us, Doug Belding is going to lead us in singing.
What a surprise.
Singing that traditional old song, Happy Birthday.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear John. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you all.
You're welcome.
So come and have a piece of cake with us and talk with John and our speaker and just have some refreshments. Thank you.